It's episode 363 of This is Whole Life, and this is the Great Question 2023 series, and this is number 2 in the series by Ken Wetmore. And I just felt like I had to put Ken Wetmore because we're going to have to break these up a little bit because we have a surprise coming next week.
That's true.
But we did. We
talked about it in church.
Did we talk about it?
We did.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we talked about it last week at the end of the podcast. I kind of feel like we made fun of him.
we did.
I think we made fun of him last week. And of course he wasn't
I think
here.
that motivated him because he's got quite the sermon planned.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
He told me
He's ready to go.
He told me about 25 minutes ago that it wasn't Friday yet. So
Don't listen to him.
I asked him how the sermon prep was going, and he's like, well, it's not Friday.
So there you go. Don't listen to him. He has to turn in his sermon to Melanie when? Thursday?
Yep.
All right.
There we go.
Well, before we get started, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Mariana Parente, who is a faithful listener.
Shout out.
And she came up to me. She caught me in the staff workroom on Sabbath, and she's like, hey, you missed my question. And I was like, oh, no. I was like, where did you leave it? She's like, in the chat. I happened to be home, and I asked the question. And I was like, okay, sorry about that. We never want to miss a question. And she's like, well, you guys answered it anyway. So it wasn't a huge issue, but you missed my question.
Oh.
And so I apologize. And if you have put a question in the chat, I don't think I'll miss an email unless it, by chance goes to the spam filter. The text messages, I've never heard of that I've missed one there. But if we've missed your question, just go ahead and send another one.
Just meet Randy in the workroom.
Or just grab Randy. Yeah.
That's it. When you see me going through the lobby, just, maybe, and if you have it written down, maybe that's a good thing too. Put on a little Post-it note and we'll put it with the show notes so we don't forget it. So this week, our question was, is it ever okay to do bad things for God?
No.
All right. That's great. Next week, it's John Monday. And I couldn't resist because Ken did that and said in my first one-word sermon, no. And, maybe it's just the dad joke in me, but I was like, it worked.
Yeah.
It worked. It made me laugh. This feels almost like we delved back into, and by the comments, I feel like others felt like we kind of almost like this was a continuation of last week's message.
Yeah, it did kind of feel that way, didn't it?
In a way, like we kind of got back into that feeling. And I got an email, or the four of us got an email from someone that listened to last week's show and was just pointing out, however, just as a point of reference that, when we think about how we view things like miracles and how we view how people's suffering and whether that be the spiritual, the physical, and to not forget that, and I don't know that we addressed it specifically, but people in marginalized communities, how much they suffer just by being a part of that community, which, that's a tough place to be and something that I resonated with, and we had a nice email exchange during the week. And so just wanted to make sure we put that out there and make sure that as we're thinking about these issues that we're also including those people that we would, maybe it's not our community, but it's certainly one we would want to know and be able to share in their journey, however that is and however we can do it. So I thought that was just a nice point, and thank you for the email. I enjoyed the response and the back and forth. It was very, very, it was rewarding for me personally. So we will move on from there. Kyla made the best bent over person in history.
Oh, that's not, I thought who was first service? It was
Ruby or
Ruby.
Sylvia?
Or Sylvia.
Was it Sylvia?
Sylvia. I think it was Sylvia. Yeah. And she did a good job too. I did like the fact that she was not as compliant as, like, okay, I think I'm done here. And
that was fun.
Just like, no.
My daughter knew. She knew what.
Like, don't get up. And
apparently that wasn't the only one-word sermon she's ever heard. So.
Maybe
touche. Well played.
Maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah, nothing like welcoming your children home from college by making them get up front and be a sermon illustration for you. And just for anybody out there, my kids, I would not do that to them if I didn't know they were okay with it.
It's like week 1, welcome home. No, I enjoyed, though, the story that you based this on in Luke 13 with the woman who was bent over at the waist for 18 years. And
it was just uncomfortable watching Kyla or Sylvia do it for like 3 to 5 minutes. Like, seriously, it was like really uncomfortable. and if you felt like it was uncomfortable down and watching it, for me up front, it felt uncomfortable because I knew what I was planning on doing, but it still felt even more uncomfortable than I thought it was going to feel. Just to think that somebody was for 18 years like that, and there's still people in the world probably today who have suffered that way that long.
Was it Melanie? Did you tell Ken about the idea that person would have to identify people by their shoes?
Yeah, Melanie told me that.
That was heartbreaking. I mean, when you said that, it was like I choked up a little bit. Like if that was your existence, that everybody that you met, you might learn to recognize, like, I know when Melanie's coming down the hall, I've got her cadence down. If my door's open, it's like, hey, Melanie, is that you? And it's like, I don't know why I'm asking. I know it's her. Or, someone's voice, you get to know that. But especially for strangers, if you're out in the market or if you're having to do some other chore, that people that you come and interact with, you would like buy their shoes. And after seeing the visual and then having that on top of it, I was like, wow, this really was. I mean, it's easy to pass off. It wasn't like, the lady who was bleeding for, what was it, 15 years?
12 years.
12 years? I mean, that seems like a horrific way to have to live your life as well. But and this is a story that I don't think we hear that often, except for the you hypocrites part. I feel like otherwise we don't really delve too much into that part of the story. And yet that part of the story was actually my favorite part, just to stop and think about where people are with whatever they might have. And a lot of times it's not as obvious as the person being, punched over at the waist and not being able to. I mean, in today's world, I think we would probably, hopefully have some kind of we have chiropractors, we have surgeons, we have things that may be able to alleviate that. But then thinking back to the email, also making sure that we have the empathy for the things that we can't see.
But I think that's worth thinking about for a minute there, Randy, because there are still a lot of afflictions, a lot of things that people suffer from that don't have a cure.
Yeah.
It brings them pain from the community. That woman who walked into the synagogue every week. I mean, think about the courage it must have taken for that woman to walk into the synagogue every week, knowing that probably every single person in that place was judging her and saying, I wonder what she did. I wonder what her parents did. They did something to make God punish her this way. And yet to still faithfully show up, still faithfully worship. I think that it's worth thinking about that it's that there are people to this day that show up to church that are judged, and what the courage it takes to show up to church when you've got a bunch of people looking at you thinking, well, this person's a sinner, or this person is must be upset with them for something, or and so I think it's one of the reasons why we have Whole Life. One of the reasons why we do things the way that we do them here is because we want everybody to know they're loved, cared about, and belong.
We don't want our community to be the source of that suffering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea that, you brought out about pity versus compassion, and I thought it was very interesting that a lot of times, I mean, I think everybody knows the difference between pity versus compassion, but I also don't think we always realize when we're not using one versus the other, when it's really pity that seems like compassion that we're talking. And, those are when the cringeworthy statements usually escape us and maybe not always on purpose, like it's a bad thing, but sometimes it seems like the pity comes out while you're trying to be compassionate, or maybe it's you're trying to step or tread lightly so you don't say something that would come across as pity, even though it's maybe part of compassion. Where do you see that line? Because I think that's one that we get tripped up, or it maybe keeps us from engaging because it's like, I do not want them to think that I'm pitying them. And then if you have to say I'm not pitying you, you're pitying me. That seems like a dangerous minefield to navigate sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part, because a lot of times we don't want help from somebody else if we believe that it's coming from pity.
Sure.
As a lot of times we rather just stay bent over, so to speak, than to have to deal with somebody's pity, because it in a sense, it has not just, a bit of judgment with it, but it also has some condescending. And, she couldn't see who was looking at her with those kind of thoughts that Ken was talking about.
Boy, you can feel them though, can't you?
Yeah.
You don't actually have to look at people sometimes just to feel it, just to feel the...
Yeah, and you wonder what she must have seen, because she did allow Jesus. I mean, that was not coming from pity. It was coming from compassion for her. So, but it is hard. It's a really hard thing when we have lived that way for a long time to not think of somebody's actions or help or a desire to change the way things are for us as not pity.
If you've been that way that long, what would you assume that something in others would all of a sudden change? I mean, what can they do for you? I mean, in that kind of at least in a medical sense, I mean, obviously you could befriend somebody and you could find out if there's ways you can help or be of service to them. But in the end, I mean, if you're her, again, you're staring at the same feet and hearing the same voices. And I think sometimes it's almost like when you lose, for her, it might even be like losing a sense. I mean, because your vision is at the ground, maybe those ears become more keen, and that's part of what she had to deal with. But I liked how Ken, you said when he said daughter, this all-inclusive statement. And, there's things that every so often you hear and they just trigger. Like I think, Ken, you mentioned this last week. It just makes me love Jesus more when something like this happens. And that's one of those statements where you kind of, I think secretly we put ourselves in those situations and go, man, I wish Jesus would come and say, son, to me, or daughter to me.
And that's probably a very, in a sense, a very real piece of her estrangement or part of her feeling of, I don't fit with anybody. And because it might have been a likely story for her family to have said, well, we don't really want to be a part of this because then we're going to get blamed for it. And we were good. There was nothing wrong with us. So she's probably dealing with it on her own maybe. And so maybe Jesus calling her daughter, just like Jesus, by the way, calls the woman who you just mentioned who was bleeding for 12 years, calls her daughter too.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder what her relationship was with the community after that.
Yeah.
Because
where she could look him in the eye.
Right. Yeah. But and Jeff, I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but I've read the different studies about how when you have someone in the family who is sick or who is, for example, an alcoholic who then tries to make changes and recover, the family has sort of built up around that dynamic of that one person who's sick, and they almost won't allow that person to change. So it makes me wonder if she actually was able to sort of enter the society and culture she was already in as who she was, or if she had been known all of her life as the woman bent over and then known for the rest of her life as the person who used to be bent over, or if they actually allowed her to live into this new identity or way of being.
I even thought it would be uncomfortable for her maybe afterwards when she's healed, has to be elated, has to be like in disbelief and like rocking back and forth. Can I twist? What can my back do now that it hasn't been able to do for so long? And then Jesus immediately speaking to you hypocrites, and it's like, oh wow, this is getting a little intense all over what just happened to me, and then how that might have influenced even how the community saw her. Would they be jealous that maybe this happened to someone who maybe didn't deserve it because they were a sinner? And who was this Jesus guy anyway, making a mockery of the rules and of the ruling leaders?
I also wonder how she felt about being an object lesson. Mm-hmm. Her experience ended up being an object lesson. So sure, she got healed out of it, but she also had to suffer the attitude of people who didn't think she should be healed then, And I wonder what kind of embarrassment or humiliation or shame might have come along with that situation, and how that interacted with maybe the elation of being healed.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't think about that from the standpoint of she's probably, well, you don't know, but she probably didn't have a lot of resiliency type skills that she could immediately stand up straight and all of a sudden say, hey, I'm not worried about whether I'm an illustration for Jesus working on the Sabbath or not. I'm glad, I don't know if she had that, but the priests are like Ken mentioned in his sermon, they literally did not want to talk at all about whether or not she was healed. I'm sure they used her for illustrations as to, family or personal sins many times. And now they had to walk all that back, and they weren't happy. And so they just kind of said, well, let's attack Jesus. But the woman, she's caught in the middle, much like the blind man, who was caught in the middle of that. But I think Jesus, that's a good point, but I still think it was from compassion that he does this. So I think...
Yeah, do you think that Jesus healed her in order for her to be an object lesson, or do you think he healed her because he had compassion on her?
Honestly, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd like to think it was compassion.
Because, here's the thing. How many other people were there that he could have healed where no one was watching? It makes me think that perhaps he saw an opportunity not only to do this for her, but also to send this message to somebody else. And he was able to accomplish both with one event.
The yes and healing.
Maybe.
I like that. Oh, I mean.
Well, it certainly obviously was perceived that way by the writers of the Gospels, because that's how they do a lot of Jesus' miracles, especially, you mentioned John. John's are always to...
I always wonder whether they didn't have the same sensibilities that we may have today, which is neither right nor wrong. It's just they had different sensibilities, different culture. But I do sometimes wonder if some of these people gave the writers permission to tell their stories because they were so grateful. And I mean, like, when I tell stories about my kids, I always am asking, are you okay with me telling that story? And they're like, yeah, I'm like, hey, because people, no, tell the story. It makes a good point.
Well, when by the time the Gospels were actually written, there's a good chance that some of those people weren't even around anymore. So the stories have been told and retold and retold. So they may not have been there to give permission. Who knows?
For that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, we have a long list of questions, so I don't want to go too much longer, but I didn't want to stop. I've got way more than I know we're going to cover, but I liked how, the question is what I'm about to do life-giving and the loving thing to do as a little checklist. But then the context matters. I thought maybe if there was any point that might be worth going over is, it seems like when you're talking about context, it's almost a free pass to be like, well, that's what the rules are. But if context matters, then let's, and we're going to use the two. Is it life-giving and is it the loving thing to do? But we can talk ourselves.
Yeah, a lot of people get afraid of this because it lends towards the moral relativism.
Yeah.
What's right for you is right for you. What's right for me is right for me. And if you heard that in the sermon, go back and listen to it again because the point is that love is the moral. That is the moral. That is the being loving and giving life is what everything else is based off of.
It's not so much moral relativism as it is use your brainism.
That's the way I view it. But we get ourselves into so many problems when we make everything absolute. And if I treat I want to treat Eric the same as I treat Kyla. Well, that's a problem because Kyla is a different human being than Eric is. And it used to drive me nuts when my parents would be like, well, we punish your brother differently than you because he's a different person. I'm like, just punish him, but as now as a parent, I get it a lot more. It's like, that is not effective on one child. That's effective on the other. But I know what my ultimate outcome for both of my children is. I want them to grow up to be good people who make a difference in the world they're in. And everything I'm doing is pointing towards that. I want them to love God and I want them to be loving people. And so the way I go about doing things, it may be different, but it's the same goal is the bottom line. And I believe that as God as a parent is trying to help us love people. And that's the point, is what is the loving thing to do? What is the life-giving thing to do? And that's not moral relativism. That's just applying the principle of what God's trying to do. That's not saying that, do what you want to do. In fact, I think the loving thing to do is often the thing I don't want to do. The self-sacrificing thing, the forgiveness, the things that I struggle and don't want to do.
The really hard things. Yeah.
Although I do have to say that your sermon was used against me afterward in the lobby.
Oh, nice.
I don't know if it was used against me, but I had, after it was Mother's Day. We gave out all these little, Mother's Day treats to all the mothers. And at the end, I had a few left over, and I was kind of looking around to make sure that all the women who were there received one. And a kid came up to me and asked me for one, and I said, "Well, these are for the ladies in the congregation." And he wanted one for his mom. And the argument was used: "Is this the life-giving thing to do? Is this the loving thing to do?"
Oh.
And he may or may not have walked away with a treat. I couldn't say no to that one.
Well, all I'll say is, well done, young man.
But done. I actually had somebody come up to me and say something too that I thought I did not want to miss. And I don't know, this may or may not be in the questions, but I want to make sure we don't miss this. Somebody came up to me and expressed concern, and what they said really resonated with me. And if I could go back and change one thing about my sermon, this is what I would change, to be very clear about. And they said, "Ken, what concerns me about your sermon is is it life-giving, is it loving, is what abusive people will often say to keep people in abusive relationships. They'll say, "Oh, well, you need to be loving to me," because, even though they're not being loving back, even though they're being cruel, and they're like, "Well, but what's the loving thing to do? You need to remember to forgive and not hold grudges, and, and how dare you do that?" And like I said, if I could add one thing into my sermon that wasn't there, is that the caveat has to be in there that the other person is not taking away life and being unloving in what they're doing, because God has boundaries, and we should have boundaries too. If you're being abused by somebody, you have every right to tell that person that until they are able to get the help that they need, that you don't need to be putting yourself in that position. And it is actually the loving thing to do that for them, because abusive people are not happy. There's trauma in their life that they need to work out. And the loving thing to do is to put a boundary that forces them to head in that direction.
Well, and I don't know if you mentioned this in your sermon or if we just chatted about this throughout the week, but you mentioned something specific about this principle, this Jewish principle, that had to do with the innocent.
Yeah. Are you talking about the Jewish? Are we talking?
That's imperative that you do it.
Well,
is that what you're referring to?
No, I'm referring to the idea that if someone is an abusive person, they are not the innocent in the situation.
Correct.
Right. So what you are doing to that person that is inhibiting them from doing things that are not life-giving to other people, they're not the innocent in that situation.
Well, I'll share one that's. I had this conversation with an acquaintance of mine in Nashville who's a rabbi there, and he was presenting to a class that I taught. And I think that the class, I can't remember whether he voluntarily said this or whether the class asked him what the Jewish position was on abortion. And I really want to be careful to not misquote him, because it was really brilliant, the things he said, and it was very interesting. But if I am recalling the first part of this correctly, and this is the part is that the Jewish position is that abortion should not happen, that it's not, they would encourage members of their community not to have abortions. But what I remember vividly is that he told the class, however, if the baby is threatening the life of the mother, then not only should there be an abortion, there must be an abortion, because it is the baby that is threatening the innocent life. It is basically the mother is trying to nurture life, and the baby is threatening the life of the mother. Therefore, and keep this in a Jewish context, the baby is becoming a murderer. The baby is threatening life, and therefore the baby is the one that whose life would be forfeit in that position. And I know that maybe, some of you may listen to that and struggle, but it's an interesting thing because it follows the principle that I was talking about in the sermon of this life-giving thing. Is it life-giving or is it not? And so from that Jewish standpoint, whenever something's threatening life, that's the thing that's of concern, the thing that needs to be dealt with, the thing that needs to be worked with. And again, it was a fascinating thing to hear that rabbi talk about that, because I'd never really heard that perspective on things before. I've heard people say, well, of course, if a mother's life is being threatened, of course, then the baby. And I've heard people say, well, you just need to let God figure that out, whichever one, if both die, that was God's will. And if the mom dies, then that was God's will, and the baby survives, that was God's will. The rabbi had the point that I shared with you, and that he thought it was incumbent from a Jewish standpoint that the life of the mother who is life-giving be preserved in that case.
I think it's important to mention that just like there are different denominations within Christianity, there are different denominations within Judaism, and there are different denominations within Islam. So I don't know if that's like the official Jewish position, or if that is the position of people who. Yeah,
he was part of the. I think he was a conservative Orthodox. Yeah, he was Orthodox, not ultra Orthodox, but Orthodox.
Well, I like the thought process at least, that it gives some continuity to.
Yeah, there's so many different that was good in terms of life giving. But then how far do you go down, even with abusive issues, dealing with maybe it's not death, maybe it's quality of life, maybe it's. You can get into these ethical issues of how far do I go with this idea? Well, I'm becoming it's the abuser, and I think these are good conversations, and I think these are the conversations that churches should be having, and I think not just churches but communities should be having, because when it comes right down to it, the husband may not be threatening the life of his wife, but the abuse that's going on only escalates. And we have to realize that, especially in a lot of our issues with mental health, we see that stair step of abuse.
Escalates.
Well, and you can be dead inside without being dead.
And I think that it goes back to the sermon that I gave when I was doing the sermon on the 10 Commandments about thou shalt not murder.
Right.
And that murder goes, in my opinion, when you look at that text, it goes far beyond just physically killing somebody, that you can emotionally kill somebody. There's a lot of ways to kill somebody that doesn't necessarily put them in a grave, but that causes them immense suffering. And that is taking away life.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and that fits in with what we're talking about seamlessly, really. So I will, just like last week, we put a track back to Melanie's topic on sibling rivalry in the show notes. This week we'll put a link back to that one. So if you want to investigate that a little bit more, I will put both the message from Speaking of Grace in the show notes and also that podcast episode. Good. So you can just click to those really simply and easy if you want to go and check that out if you've missed it or just want to refresh. All right, let's hit the questions. There was a ton, and I think maybe the most entertaining question, and I saw it happen.
Well, let's do that one first.
I saw it happen in real time, and it just made me smile. It was from Aaron, and this was the teaser as well. He said, I just realized something last night. God killed to keep Adam and Eve from the elements when he provided the animal skins after they fell. And Stanley responded to it, "Are you saying this is an example of a bad thing that God did for good people?" And she's like, "Yeah, it's true." And she put a little laughing emoji. I was wondering if that would fit, because I never thought of God actually killing anything. But we don't think of killing animals for survival as a bad thing, so maybe it doesn't fit. So what do you think? Does it fit that God, it doesn't say he explicitly killed something, but where did the animal skins come from?
He created them.
Yeah, you don't think God can create animal skins without animals?
All right, Aaron, there's your answer. I'm sorry. I was on your side, honestly.
We snuck around it, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, we did.
Well, it's an interesting thing that I mentioned Dennis Prager's book on Deuteronomy. And if you read through the book of Deuteronomy, it becomes pretty apparent to you pretty quickly that human life from at least the book of Deuteronomy is on a different level than animal life as far as worth goes, that animal life is considered to be less than a human life. And so it's one of the reasons why people eat meat. We don't, and why we don't, and we don't eat humans. And so when God made those skins, however he chose to make them, one of the things that probably the writer of Genesis was probably trying to impress on the readers was that death did follow Adam and Eve's. When the serpent said, "You won't die," their death did. What they did create death. There was immediate consequences, not only to themselves but to the environment around them. And it's really a worthwhile thing for us to think about that the things that I do can create pain for others and suffering for others. And so I have a moral responsibility to be thinking not just about what's best for me, but what preserves life and what gives life, and not just be focused on what's best for me.
Yeah.
They didn't ask the other question, though. Four chapters later, he's wiping out everybody, including animals.
Yeah, I was waiting for that one.
Well, she did continue later on. Aaron, you were the superstar of the chat this week. What about Job, and she missed this one, offering his daughters to the men as a trade for them to leave the men or the angels alone? Was that bad or good of Job? And Stanley replied, "I think you're thinking of Lot," which is an interesting example. And Stanley said, "I'm not sure how the daughters felt about it, but Lot definitely valued messengers of God above his own family, apparently."
Lot had some real interesting issues when it came to his daughters, by the way, can we just say? And I think it's safe to say, in my opinion, firstly, there is no mention of God telling Lot to give his daughters to the men of the. And I think it's safe to say that I think that the Bible actually pretty roundly criticizes Lot for the way that he behaved and what was going on there. And so I would say that is a situation of someone doing a bad thing, and it was a bad thing.
It was a bad thing. It was not when a good thing becomes a... No. Or not when a bad thing becomes a good thing. I was totally wrong on that. Crank, back, don't even listen to that. Just hit ahead 15 seconds, and we'll totally act like that just never happened. The next one was from Jan, who asked, how many times can someone make the same mistakes knowingly and still expect to be forgiven? That's my question.
0.
Another one-word sermon.
Okay.
I think that's a really important thing for us to think about. I may have an obligation to forgive as a Christian, but a person who's continually, intentionally doing harmful things has no right to expect forgiveness or to demand it, or to demand that things, and that goes back to what we were talking about before. We see abusive people who love to use Christianity as, well, you've got to forgive me. And of course, we believe what Christ said, that we need to forgive, but I think it's incredibly arrogant and narcissistic to think that you can be abusive to people and they owe it to you to forgive you. That's not, they don't owe it to you. That's grace if they do it. And I think that I see too many times where I see people who perpetrate pain and harm on another demand that person forgive on their schedule. and I don't think it's up to the perpetrator to dictate to the victim when and how they have to forgive.
Yeah,
that's just my.
Yeah, I don't want to say that we shouldn't have a forgiving heart. I think we should always have a forgiving heart. I think that's a good lesson. But I think what maybe the question they're saying is condoning the action, because I don't think any of us should condone somebody's intentional abuse of us.
Yeah, I think the part where she says knowingly, I think that
but read the question one more time, because I want. Okay. There's how it was written, and then there's maybe how it was meant.
Yeah.
But go ahead and read how it was written.
How many times can someone make the same mistakes, plural, knowingly, and still expect to be forgiven?
That's an interesting way of saying it.
But that's the thing. How many times can they expect? And that's why I say zero. They don't have an expectation that they should be forgiven. Now, if you're asking how many times can somebody do that to me and I need to forgive, that's a different question.
Well, it goes back to God, though. We make mistakes every single stinking day, and we are forgiven. And that's the relationship that we're in.
Unfortunately, we're not God on the. And we're probably not as good as God on the forgiving.
No, we're not. But again, I think it goes to the fact that we do mix up, and I'm not. This is the point I'm trying to make. I'm not saying I'm disagreeing. I'm saying we mix up the idea that forgiveness means condoning, or forgiveness means accepting that as appropriate behavior.
But that's part of the forgiveness, isn't it? Isn't if you're forgiving someone and saying that, look, I'm forgiving. I mean, for me, in my mental wealth, my mental health, and my mental well-being, and being a believer in Christ, I feel like I have to forgive you for me.
Right.
I don't have to forgive you for you.
It'll be worse for you if you don't do it for.
Right. Yeah. Because then I'm carrying the load of what you've done to me. Plus, and when I could have forgiven it and moved it off. But that also doesn't mean that you get to keep doing it to me.
Exactly.
You need to. Okay. Now we're our friendship until you are ready to own up to what you've done and this consistent behavior. Then you need to leave me alone. And that's the parameters with which we're working in. Not that we don't have to be like, if we were friends and something came between us, we're not going to hang out anymore. We're not going to go do whatever we used to do. And it's not going to be hunky dory until I know that you're serious, that you take my forgiveness, not as, like you said, a blank check. Here you go. Now you can beat me up again. But as I'm forgiving you because this is for me.
No, that's a good point. Good.
I was just going to say, I don't think that forgiveness is condoning, because the very act of forgiveness is acknowledging that you did something wrong.
Right.
And I am forgiving you for the thing that you did wrong. So I don't know that condoning.
But I don't think the abuser takes it that way, though.
I don't think, though, that somebody. So to go a little further, because I can feel people like being really upset that I said 0 times when Jesus clearly said 70 times 7. And here's what I'd say: as a Christian, I have an obligation to forgive as I've been forgiven. And and that doesn't mean that if Melanie does something awful to me that she has to ask me for forgiveness. In fact, I owe the forgiveness whether she asks or changes or doesn't change, doesn't matter. I have to forgive. But where we get confused as Christians is that forgiveness is somehow the same as restoration of relationship, and that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness doesn't mean that the restoration that everything goes back to normal and that I just have to go ahead and put up with Melanie slamming my head into the door every time that I walk into her office. That's not forgiveness. Is giving up the right to get even.
Yeah.
To me, that's what it is. It's me letting go of my right, to get even or to get ahead. And so for me, that's I also just would think, for me, forgiveness isn't always something that just wells out of you after you've been hurt deeply. It's sometimes something that it's a process and takes time to work your way through. And so that's what I guess that's where it's such a difficult topic.
Yeah. And I don't want people who are, there's going to be some people who are listening who have, suffered a great deal of abuse maybe in their lives. And for us to cavalierly just say, you need to forgive them.
Yeah.
That's a really hard thing sometimes to do, even when we do separate it from condoning.
Yeah, you can't. You can only forgive to the degree that you understand how much you've been hurt.
Exactly.
If you forgive superficially, the wound stays there and just continues to fester. And so forgiveness might not come all at once. You might actually have to re-forgive someone. When you realize, oh, wait a minute, that wound is still there and it's deeper than I thought it was. So now I've got to clean all that out and see, what forgiveness looks like for that. I think we tell people you need to forgive, and it's kind of like, all right, I forgive first, and there it is. But forgiveness is a process, and it's more for you than it is for anybody else, and it can happen regardless of whether or not the other person repents.
Oh, it has to, yeah.
Or even accepts.
And I don't know that you necessarily have to give someone, that absolution that makes them feel, psychologically restored, especially if it's someone who is an abuser.
Yeah. But I agree with you, Ken, from the standpoint of that piece is not restoration of the relationship, but it may be the first step if restoration even is possible of the relationship. Yeah.
A long time ago, over 20 years ago, I think it's at least been over 20 years since I've read a book by Dick Tibbits, Forgive to Live. And it's if you're not really, haven't really thought about it, but you need to forgive and you're not really sure how that works. And it may not be an answer all for everything, but it's a place to start. It's something you can write notes in. It's a book I've read I think I've read it 3 times now.
We have a couple of those books here in the church because
do we really?
We have a good friend who is who had a whole bunch of them in a warehouse
from the
and so
from the publishing
and I don't know, I'm trying to debate whether I'm allowed to call him out by name, but thank you, Todd.
Thanks, Todd.
From publishing, yeah.
So anyway, we're actually probably going to be working through that book next year.
Yeah.
I think that's on our church's reading list.
Well, I know I've referenced this in the past, and so there is a link already, but I'll make sure it gets included in the show notes because I have noticed it is one of the links that people have clicked on a ton of times out of our show notes, and it'll just take you to Amazon to find the book, or if we have some here.
Or if you hold on, you might be able to get a free one.
Yeah. But it was something that really changed my life about not taking and holding on to past grievances and just realizing that it was really more for me than them. We can sort the other details out as we go. Like Melanie said, it may take a long time, but knowing that that's part of what I need to do, to me, it makes the process start earlier than just holding on to it and going, well, yeah, I suppose I'm supposed to forgive this person, aren't I, after 6 months or a year? If you're starting that process and you're working through it through prayer and through your daily worship and just talking to God about it, I think it breaks down those barriers on your side faster that way than to let it fester. And that seems like to me, it seems like the hole's a little bit deeper to dig out of if you don't actually understand that, like what the benefits are to you and why maybe starting earlier than later is better.
I don't know. Maybe this hasn't, but I think of it this way. When I was a kid, I always had to do exactly what my parents told me immediately. There was no standing around. There was no arguing. However, there was a loophole.
Ooh,
as long as I was moving in the direction to do what I was told, I could make a case for why I thought something should be different. And I wonder, I know this is kind of a stretch, but I wonder if in our relationship with God, if we say, God, I can't forgive this person, but I am oriented in the direction of forgiveness. And I will let you do what there is to do. And it can take time as long as you're oriented in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
I like that.
Okay. We are just about to the end of the questions. This one was from Chad, and man, it was good to see Chad in the chat. Chad in the chat. Chad in the chat. Easy for me to say, Chad in the chat.
Well, I think he has a new the social media name. Chad in the chat.
Chad in the chat.
Chad in the chat. Love you, Chad. As I read through the life of Jesus, he seems far more concerned about a person's heart than comparing their actions to a list of approved good things to do. He even says that good things done for wrong reasons is not acceptable. Perhaps we are too focused on the wrong things. Man looks at the outside appearance and actions, but God looks at the heart.
thought that was a good comment.
Yeah, me too.
Good.
I think he
I
was
concur.
right.
Ends us well.
I think it was right on point. And then there were multiple people all the way through the message, comments like, oh, this sermon is talking to me. Amen. Me too. And so I think that, we've hit on these great questions, and well, no doubt that it's because they're questions from those, from people that attend Whole Life and online or in person each week. And that these messages are really striking a chord. And finally, there was and this is more of just a comment, why is loving thy neighbor so hard for us humans? Anonymous wanted to know. And Anne said, because we don't really like the way they live or believe. And Stanley said, that is the question. I want to believe that if everyone put everyone else first, then it wouldn't be so hard to love your neighbor. There you go, Stanley. Good job.
Good point.
Stanley does such a good job in the chat. Isn't he a good host? Good moderator.
He's got it all. He's got the host. He's got the moderator, and every so often I like to jump in and play along with them. But this week I was too busy, and they were just killing it. And so, thank you everyone for the questions. I think that again there'll be those items in the show notes if you want to go a little bit deeper. And if you have a question, something that we could have said, should have said, 407-965-1607 or podcast@WholeLife.Church. And as already mentioned, John Monday will be preaching, and his question, here it is. All right. Do our words contain divine power? Can our words call forth divine power? How do we get that power? Man, he got 3 in 1. That's a tall
whammy.
order. I know. So
the trifecta.
But so the hat trick for Mr. Monday. So we will be praying for him this week as he continues to work into Friday. Allegedly, he's already started, according to Ken, but I don't know.
Oh, he's on it.
You think he's on it?
Oh,
Yeah,
I know he's on it.
I think you better be on it because 3 questions is a lot to take care of all at once. So anyway, thank you guys so much. Someone else had mentioned that we had a few audio issues in the past week, and so I am working on those. But thank you for pointing them out because I don't usually listen to the podcast. When it sounds good in the editor, I'm like, all right, we're good to go. And so I count on some other people because I'm not only here, then I edit it, and then I put it out. So that would be the 3rd time through for me. So
Good thing you got such smart people you're working with that are so interesting to listen to.
That's
all the time,
what I'm
right?
saying, that we got people that are willing to just be like, hey, that wasn't the best effort ever. Well, hopefully we get that cleared up. But also, we hit our 4th month in a row of over 1,500 listens a month. So we have, you guys are awesome sharing the show and listening. And
thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It just, we've really appreciated all of your efforts. So that's going to do it for this week. Next week, John Monday will be here. I'm Tuesday, but then Wednesday for you, John Monday will be here.
Yeah.
And that's going to do it. Anyone else got anything else?
That's all, folks.
And he is?
I am. Ken Wetmore.
Have a great week, everyone.